The silence of the vast library at Oakhaven was not empty. It was thick, textured, and laden with the unacknowledged weight of 3 generations of systematic neglect. Lady Eleanor Vance sat at the massive mahogany desk, her posture perfectly erect, her hands resting lightly on the leather-bound ledger that detailed the imminent financial collapse of her ancestral home. She was 24 years of age, a woman who had spent the last decade perfecting the art of absolute invisibility. In a society that valued women for their decorative utility and their capacity to serve as conduits for wealth and title, Eleanor had long ago recognized that her survival depended on her ability to blend into the damask wallpaper and the shadowed corners of the estate. She was not unbeautiful, but she had learned to dim her own light, to speak softly, to cast her eyes downward, and to offer no threat to the fragile, vicious vanity of her stepmother, Countess Margaret. The library was her sole refuge, a room the Countess and her 2 biological daughters found intolerably dusty and entirely devoid of amusement. Here, Eleanor was not the awkward, silent spinster stepdaughter. She was the secret architect holding the crumbling foundations of Oakhaven together through sheer intellectual force and meticulous accounting. Eleanor dipped her quill into the inkwell, the scratch of the nib against the heavy parchment, the only sound in the cavernous room. She was currently reviewing the tenant leases for the eastern farmlands, noting with a cold, detached precision the discrepancies between what the tenants had paid and what the Countess had recorded in the official household accounts. The specific quality of Margaret's desperation had become increasingly apparent over the past 6 months. The Countess was skimming the estate's already meager revenues to fund a desperate, lavish London season for her eldest daughter, Clara. Margaret's strategy was as transparent as it was ruinous. She intended to secure a marriage of supreme elevation for Clara before the creditors descended upon Oakhaven to strip the silver from the dining room and the paintings from the gallery. The target of this matrimonial ambush was Arthur, the Duke of Westford, a man of formidable wealth and terrifying reputation, who was expected to arrive at the estate within the fortnight. The Duke held the primary mortgage on the Oakhaven lands, a debt incurred by Eleanor's late, foolish father. Margaret believed that by offering Clara to the Duke, she could simultaneously erase the debt and elevate herself to the highest echelons of society. Eleanor, looking at the numbers, knew the Duke would have to be an utter imbecile to accept such a bargain, and everything she had read of Arthur of Westford suggested he was a man who calculated the value of every breath he took. The realization that her stepmother was not merely foolish, but actively committing fraud against the estate and, by extension, against the Duke himself, was a heavy burden, yet Eleanor carried it with her customary stoicism. She had spent years observing the social mechanics and power dynamics of her household, categorizing the cruelties and the vanities with the dispassionate eye of a natural philosopher studying a particularly venomous species of insect. She knew that to confront Margaret directly would be to invite destruction. The Countess possessed the legal authority of a guardian and the moral flexibility of a starving wolf. Instead, Eleanor had spent the winter quietly compiling a secondary set of ledgers, the true accounts. These books, bound in plain brown leather and hidden beneath a loose floorboard beneath the window seat, contained the unvarnished reality of Oakhaven. They detailed the exact yields of the wheat harvests, the precise costs of the mill repairs that Margaret had falsely claimed were completed, and the meticulous, devastating record of every pound the Countess had diverted to the London modistes. Eleanor did not yet know how she would use this information, but she understood the fundamental rule of the world she inhabited. Knowledge was power, but only if deployed at the precise moment when the enemy had committed themselves beyond the point of retreat. It was a Tuesday afternoon, 3 days before the Duke's scheduled arrival, when the fragile equilibrium of Eleanor's existence was violently shattered. She had been careless, a rare and unforgivable error born of exhaustion. She had left the true ledger on the desk while she climbed the library ladder to retrieve a volume on agricultural crop rotation. She did not hear the library doors open. She only heard the sharp, indrawn breath of her stepmother. Eleanor turned, her hand gripping the wooden rung of the ladder, to see Countess Margaret standing by the desk, her manicured hands resting on the open pages of the secret accounts. For a moment, the room was suspended in a terrible, clarifying silence. Eleanor watched the progression of emotions flit across her stepmother's face. Initial confusion, followed by dawning comprehension, and finally, a white-hot, terrifying rage. Margaret was not an intellectual woman, but she possessed the feral cunning of the profoundly selfish, and she understood immediately what she was looking at. She understood that the quiet, invisible stepdaughter she had treated as a glorified servant possessed the means to not only ruin her plans for Clara, but to see her transported for fraud. "You wretched, deceitful little creature," Margaret whispered, her voice trembling not with sorrow, but with the specific quality of absolute malice that arises when the arrogant are suddenly confronted with their own vulnerability. She did not yell. Yelling would bring the servants, and this was a matter that required the darkness of closed doors. Margaret slammed the ledger shut and looked up at Eleanor, who remained perfectly still on the ladder. Eleanor did not attempt to explain, nor did she offer apologies. She merely looked down at the woman who had made her life a quiet purgatory, her expression composed, analyzing the exact depth of the danger she was now in. This lack of fear, this utter absence of the submission Margaret expected, seemed to infuriate the Countess more than the ledgers themselves. It was an affront to the natural order of the house. Margaret ordered Eleanor down from the ladder with a sharp, snapping gesture of her hand. When Eleanor complied, moving with deliberate, unhurried grace, Margaret seized her by the wrist, her fingernails digging painfully into Eleanor's flesh. "You think you are clever," Margaret hissed, her face inches from Eleanor's. "You think you will show these to the Duke and play the tragic heroine. You think he will look at you, you pale, insignificant mouse, and see a savior." Eleanor said nothing. She allowed her wrist to remain in Margaret's agonizing grip, refusing to grant the woman the satisfaction of a struggle. Her mind was already racing ahead, calculating the variables, assessing what Margaret's next move must logically be. The Countess could not destroy the ledgers. Eleanor had calmly informed her, in a voice as dry as autumn leaves, that a third copy resided with a solicitor in London, to be released in the event of her untimely demise or disappearance. It was a bluff, of course, but Margaret did not know that, and the Countess was not a woman who understood the intricacies of legal safeguards. Therefore, Margaret could not kill her, nor could she banish her from the house without arousing the suspicion of the Duke, who would certainly inquire after the late Earl's only biological child. Margaret's only recourse was to ensure that Eleanor was utterly discredited, humiliated, and rendered so entirely wretched that the Duke would not spare her a second glance, let alone entertain a conversation regarding mathematics and estate management. Eleanor watched the wheels turning behind Margaret's eyes, saw the moment the cruel inspiration struck, and felt a cold knot form in her stomach. "You are unwell, Eleanor," Margaret announced, her voice suddenly adopting a tone of theatrical, cloying concern that was far more terrifying than her rage. "Yes, I see it now. The strain of your father's death, though years past, has finally broken your fragile mind. You have been acting erratically. You have a fever, a dangerous, consuming brain fever." Margaret released Eleanor's wrist and stepped back, a triumphant, vicious smile playing upon her lips. "It is a tragedy, right before His Grace arrives. We must take immediate precautions to preserve your health and the safety of the household." She turned and swept toward the bell pull, yanking it with violent force. Eleanor remained by the desk, her mind working with cold, frantic speed. She understood exactly what Margaret was orchestrating. It was a classic maneuver of the desperate tyrant: pathologize the opposition. If Eleanor was mad, her ledgers were the scribblings of a lunatic. If she was feverish, her isolation was an act of medical mercy. But Eleanor also knew that Margaret would not stop at mere confinement. The Countess required a visible, undeniable proof of Eleanor's degradation, something that would strip away her dignity and render her a creature of pity and revulsion in the eyes of a man like the Duke of Westford. When the housekeeper and two of the sturdier footmen arrived, Margaret's performance was flawless. She wept dry tears, claiming that Lady Eleanor had suffered a sudden, violent break from reality, that she was raving about numbers and plots, and that the physician in the village had previously warned of such a collapse. Eleanor did not fight as the footmen, looking deeply uncomfortable but bound by their employment, took her arms. To struggle would only validate Margaret's claims of hysteria. She walked with them up the grand staircase to her small, drafty bedchamber beneath the eaves. Once inside, Margaret dismissed the footmen and summoned her own personal maid, a hard-faced woman named Beatrice, who had long served as the Countess's enforcer in the servants' hall. Margaret locked the door behind them. "The fever is entirely too high," Margaret declared, her eyes gleaming with a manic, vindictive light. "The humors are trapped in her head. We must cool the brain. The hair must be removed. All of it." Eleanor felt a sudden, sharp intake of breath freeze in her throat. Her hair was a rich, heavy chestnut, falling in thick waves to her waist. It was her one point of vanity, the only feature her father had ever praised. To shear it was an act of penal humiliation, a punishment reserved for fallen women, convicts, and the violently insane. "You overplay your hand, madam," Eleanor said softly, her voice steady despite the rapid beating of her heart. "The Duke is a man of the world. He will recognize malice when he sees it." Margaret merely laughed, a sharp, barking sound. She nodded to Beatrice, who produced a pair of heavy iron sheep shears from the pocket of her apron. They had clearly been retrieved from the stables for this exact purpose. The indignity of the instrument was intentional. Eleanor was forced into a straight-backed wooden chair. She did not weep. She closed her eyes and focused on the geometry of the room, counting the floorboards, analyzing the pattern of the frost on the window pane, retreating into the fortress of her own mind. The sound of the shears was loud, a brutal metallic snipping that echoed in the small room. She felt the heavy weight of her hair fall away, landing in soft, tragic coils on the cold floorboards. She felt the chill air of the room bite into her exposed scalp. The physical sensation was shocking, a profound violation of her person, but she refused to let a single tear escape her tightly shut eyes. She understood that Margaret fed on distress. To show pain was to offer sustenance to a monster. When the rough work was done, Margaret stepped forward, holding a mirror. Eleanor opened her eyes and looked at her reflection. Her head was shorn close to the scalp, leaving an uneven, jagged stubble that made her look like a starved waif from the workhouse. Her large, dark eyes seemed enormous in her pale face, the delicate bone structure of her jaw and cheekbones thrown into stark, unforgiving relief. She looked alien, stripped of her gender and her status, reduced to a raw, trembling core of humanity. Margaret smiled, a look of profound satisfaction settling over her features. "You will remain in this room until the Duke departs," Margaret commanded. If you are required to be seen, you will wear a mourning bonnet, tightly tied, to hide this unfortunate medical necessity. If you attempt to speak to His Grace, I will have the physician declare you permanently incompetent, and you shall spend the rest of your days in the asylum at Bedlam. Do we understand one another, Eleanor?" Eleanor looked from the mirror to her stepmother. She saw the fear still lurking beneath the triumphant cruelty. Margaret had committed an atrocity, and in doing so, she had handed Eleanor the ultimate weapon. "I understand you perfectly, madam," Eleanor replied, her voice eerily calm. It was the expression of someone who had just been handed the winning card in a high-stakes game and was merely waiting for the betting to finish. This quiet compliance unsettled Margaret, but the Countess brushed it aside, turning on her heel and leaving the room, locking the door securely behind her. For the next 3 days, Eleanor remained in her room. She did not waste her energy in despair. She used the time to meticulously plan. She reviewed the numbers of the estate in her head, committing every discrepancy, every fraudulent entry, to absolute memory. She anticipated the Duke's questions. Arthur of Westford was known to be a man who abhorred inefficiency and despised deception. He was coming to Oakhaven not merely to select a bride, but to audit a failing investment. Eleanor knew that Margaret would attempt to dazzle him with Clara's beauty and a facade of aristocratic leisure, masking the rot beneath the floorboards. Eleanor also knew that she could not simply burst into the drawing room and make accusations. She had to wait for the exact moment when Margaret's narrative collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions. She found the bonnet Margaret had provided, a hideous, heavy black wool creation meant for deep mourning, designed to obscure the face and press tightly against the skull. She tried it on, tying the thick ribbons beneath her chin. It was stifling, uncomfortable, and utterly degrading. It was perfect. It was the physical manifestation of Margaret's cruelty, and Eleanor intended to wear it like a crown. The morning of the Duke's arrival dawned crisp and clear. The household was in a state of frantic, terrified preparation. Eleanor could hear the shouting of the housekeeper and the scurrying of maids in the corridors below. Shortly before noon, her door was unlocked by Beatrice, who carried a tray of thin gruel and a message that the Countess required Eleanor's presence in the secondary drawing room. Margaret had apparently calculated that entirely hiding the late Earl's daughter might arouse more suspicion than presenting her as a tragic invalid. Eleanor dressed in her plainest, most worn grey day dress. She arranged the heavy black bonnet on her shorn head, ensuring not a single millimeter of stubble was visible. She descended the stairs with the quiet, measured steps of a ghost, slipping into the drawing room before the rest of the family arrived. She chose a high-backed chair in the darkest corner of the room, near the heavy velvet curtains, a position that offered a comprehensive view of the entire space while minimizing her own presence. She folded her hands in her lap and waited, her mind clear, her emotions locked away in an impenetrable vault. When the Duke of Westford entered the room, the atmosphere changed immediately. He did not merely occupy space, he commanded it. Arthur was a tall man in his early 30s, dressed in riding clothes of exquisite cut but austere color. He possessed a face that was handsome in a severe architectural manner, characterized by high cheekbones, a sharp aquiline nose, and eyes of a piercing analytical gray. He moved with the predatory grace of a man who was entirely comfortable with his own power. Countess Margaret fluttered around him like a frantic moth, introducing Clara, who curtsied perfectly, and her younger sister, who giggled nervously. The Duke offered polite, perfunctory bows, his expression revealing nothing. His gaze swept the room, taking in the faded carpets, the missing silver candlesticks, and the desperate, cloying scent of cheap rosewater that Margaret had deployed to mask the smell of damp. Finally, his eyes settled on the dark corner where Eleanor sat. He paused, a slight frown creasing his brow. The sight of a young woman wrapped in a hideous mourning bonnet, sitting silently in the shadows while the rest of the family preened in the light, was a stark incongruity. It was an anomaly in the data of the room, and Arthur of Westford did not like anomalies. "And this, your grace, is my late husband's daughter, Lady Eleanor," Margaret said, her voice dropping into a register of sorrowful pity. She positioned herself between the Duke and Eleanor, subtly blocking his path. "She has been suffering from a most grievous brain fever. The physician insisted on confinement and certain drastic measures to cool the humors. She is quite fragile, and we fear her mind wanders. It is a terrible tragedy." The Duke looked over Margaret's shoulder at Eleanor. Eleanor did not lower her eyes. She met his gaze directly, holding it with a steady, unblinking intensity. There was no madness in her eyes, no feverish wandering. There was only a cold, sharp intelligence and a silent challenge. The Duke's eyes narrowed slightly. He was a man who had spent his life navigating the treacherous waters of court politics and high finance. He knew the scent of a lie, and the Countess was practically reeking of it. He offered a slight nod to Eleanor, which she returned with a millimeter of inclination. He then turned his attention back to Margaret, though Eleanor noted with satisfaction that his stance had shifted, his body angled slightly toward her corner, keeping her in his peripheral vision. This, which was itself information, told Eleanor that the Duke was already investigating the situation. The ritual of tea was agonizingly slow. Clara attempted to engage the Duke in conversation regarding the London season, reciting opinions on the opera that had clearly been memorized from a society periodical. The Duke responded with polite, monosyllabic answers, his boredom palpable. Finally, he set his teacup down with a decisive click against the saucer. The sound cut through Clara's prattle like a knife. "Countess," the Duke began, his voice a low, resonant baritone that commanded absolute attention. "I did not travel to Oakhaven to discuss the Italian opera. I came to discuss the very pressing matter of the estate's arrears. The mortgage payments have been delinquent for 3 consecutive quarters. I have received letters from your steward detailing catastrophic harvest failures. Yet my own estates, mere 20 miles to the north, reported excellent yields. I require an explanation." Margaret blanched beneath her rouge. She stammered, her hands fluttering nervously over her silk skirts. The soil here is different, Your Grace. We suffered a terrible blight, and the mill required extensive rebuilding. The costs were astronomical. My steward assured me, "Your steward, madam, is a drunkard who has not set foot in the eastern fields in 2 years." A quiet, perfectly modulated voice spoke from the corner of the room. The silence that followed was absolute. Margaret froze, her mouth slightly open in shock. Clara and the younger sister stared in horror. The Duke turned slowly, his grey eyes locking onto Eleanor. She sat perfectly still, her hands still folded in her lap, the hideous black bonnet framing her pale face. She did not look like an invalid. She looked like a judge pronouncing a sentence. "The eastern fields did not suffer a blight," Eleanor continued, her voice gaining strength, filling the quiet room with the undeniable ring of truth. "The wheat yield was, in fact, 12% higher than the previous year. The revenue from that harvest was £420. The mill required only a minor repair to the water wheel, costing exactly £15.06, performed by Thomas the Right on the 4th of September. She recited the figures without hesitation, her mind accessing the ledgers with flawless precision. Margaret finally found her voice, a shrill, panicked shriek. "Silence. You are mad. Your Grace, you must forgive her. The fever has completely addled her wits. She invents numbers, she speaks nonsense. She must be returned to her room immediately." Margaret lunged toward Eleanor, her hands outstretched as if to physically drag her from the chair. But the Duke moved faster. He stepped into Margaret's path, holding up a single gloved hand. It was a simple gesture, but it carried the weight of generations of absolute authority. Margaret stopped instantly, breathing heavily, trapped by the terrifying stillness of the Duke. Arthur did not look at the Countess. He kept his eyes fixed entirely upon Eleanor. He was encountering a situation he had categorized in advance, a routine foreclosure on a ruined family, and was now finding the category vastly insufficient. He walked slowly toward the corner, his boots silent on the carpet. He stopped 2 feet from Eleanor, looking down at her. He studied the tension in her jaw, the dark circles under her eyes, and the unnatural, restrictive tightness of the mourning bonnet. £420, the Duke repeated softly, testing the weight of the numbers. "And where, Lady Eleanor, did this revenue go, if not to the estate's accounts?" Eleanor did not look at Margaret, though she could feel the heat of her stepmother's terrified rage radiating across the room. £200 were directed to Madame Celeste in Bond Street for a wardrobe intended for the upcoming season, Eleanor stated, her voice devoid of emotion. £50 were paid to a jeweler in Bath for the resetting of the family sapphires. The remainder was deposited into an account at a provincial bank in York, under the name of Mr. Horace Vance, the Countess's brother. The precision of the destruction was breathtaking. Eleanor had not merely accused, she had provided an audited trail of fraud. She saw the flash of realization in the Duke's eyes, the moment the pieces of the puzzle clicked into place. He understood the false ledgers, the missing funds, and the desperate, pathetic trap Margaret had attempted to set with Clara. But more importantly, he understood that the woman sitting before him, shrouded in ugly black wool and dismissed as a lunatic, was the only functioning intellect in the entire household. "Your Grace, she lies," Margaret wept, resorting to the final defense of the guilty. "She is a wicked, jealous creature. The physician shaved her head to bleed the madness from her. Look at her, she is a monster, a raving lunatic." Margaret's words were meant to disgust the Duke, to draw his attention to Eleanor's supposed physical and mental degradation. Instead, they had the opposite effect. The Duke's expression hardened into something cold and dangerous. He looked closely at the black bonnet, noting for the first time how it pressed awkwardly against Eleanor's skull, how it seemed designed not for mourning but for concealment. He understood, with a sudden, sickening clarity, the nature of the violence that had been done to her. It was not a medical procedure. It was a punishment for her competence. It was a brutal, physical silencing of the truth. Arthur of Westford was a man who valued order and intellect above all things, and the realization that this brilliant, composed woman had been subjected to such barbarity under his own roof, for he effectively owned Oakhaven now, filled him with a cold, quiet fury. He reached out. It was a breach of every known social protocol, an act of shocking intimacy and command. He did not ask permission. He reached for the thick black ribbons tied beneath Eleanor's chin, Eleanor stiffened, her breath catching in her throat. For a fraction of a second, panic flared in her eyes. This was the moment of absolute vulnerability, the public exposure of her humiliation. But she looked into the Duke's eyes and saw no pity there. She saw recognition. She saw a demand for the truth. She forced her muscles to relax. She lifted her chin slightly, exposing the knot to his fingers. The Duke untied the ribbons with deft, careful movements. He gripped the heavy wool of the bonnet and pulled it back, lifting it away from her head. He dropped the ugly garment onto the floor, where it lay like a dead, discarded thing. The silence in the drawing room became absolute, profound, and terrifying. Eleanor sat exposed. Her head, shorn of its beautiful chestnut waves, was covered in an uneven, bristling stubble. Without the softening frame of her hair, the sharp, intelligent angles of her face were severe, almost martial. She looked like a prisoner of war who had refused to break under torture. The visual impact was devastating. Clara gasped and covered her mouth. Margaret took a stumbling step backward, her face draining of all color as she realized the catastrophic error she had made. She had intended to make Eleanor look mad. Instead, she had made her look like a martyr. The Duke stood perfectly still, looking down at her bare head. He did not flinch. He did not look away in polite embarrassment. He studied the raw, brutal reality of what had been done to her, and then he looked back into her dark, unyielding eyes. In that moment, an unspoken communication passed between them, a recognition of equals across a battlefield of lesser minds. He saw her strength, her endurance, and her terrifying intellect, and Eleanor saw that he saw. It was the first time in her life she had ever been truly visible. A drastic medical measure, the Duke said, his voice terrifyingly soft as he turned slowly to face Countess Margaret. To cool the humors of a brain fever, the sarcasm in his tone was laced with arsenic. It is a remarkable fever indeed, madam, that leaves the patient with a perfect, encyclopedic recall of financial ledgers, while simultaneously destroying the memory and competence of the woman who claims to be her guardian. Margaret tried to speak, but only a pathetic choking sound emerged. The Duke did not raise his voice. He did not need to. His authority was absolute, and his judgment was final. You have attempted to defraud me, Countess. You have squandered the resources of an estate that belongs in trust to my holdings. And worse, he paused, his eyes flicking back to Eleanor. You have committed an act of profound, unforgivable barbarism against a woman whose intellect and character vastly exceed your own. You are entirely unfit to manage this estate, this household, or your own affairs. The Duke turned his back on the Countess, a gesture of absolute dismissal that severed her social and financial existence in a single movement. He looked down at Eleanor, who had remained perfectly still, absorbing the victory without a trace of a smile. Lady Eleanor, he said, his tone shifting from cold fury to one of deep, respectful inquiry. You possess the true ledgers? Eleanor nodded once. I do, Your Grace. They are hidden, but I can retrieve them within the hour. They detail every transaction legitimate and fraudulent over the past 4 years. The Duke offered a small, grim smile. I do not doubt it. I will send for my solicitor in London immediately. We will require a magistrate as well to oversee the transfer of authority. The Countess and her daughters will be given a small allowance and removed to the dower house in Yorkshire by the end of the week. They will not trouble you again. He paused, looking at the proud, shorn angle of her head. I must apologize to you, Lady Eleanor. I have visited this house 3 times in the past 5 years. I spoke to your father, I spoke to your stepmother, and I never once truly looked at you. I categorized you as part of the background, an assumption that was both arrogant and foolish. I am profoundly sorry. It was the defining moment of the reckoning. A duke did not apologize. A man of his status did not admit foolishness to a spinster with a shaved head. But Arthur of Westford was a realist, and he recognized that the woman before him was the most valuable asset in the room, perhaps in the entire county. Eleanor looked at him, analyzing the sincerity of his words. She found no deception. He meant it. It was a private truth delivered in a public space, which made it genuine. I accept your apology, Your Grace, Eleanor replied, her voice calm and even. However, I must set the terms for the future. I am not a victim to be rescued, nor am I a piece of property to be transferred along with the mortgage. I know this estate, I know the tenants, the land, and the accounts. I will manage Oakhaven. I will report to you as the primary creditor, and we will rebuild the profitability of this land together. But I will do it as the master of this house, on my own authority. She did not ask, she stated facts. She was establishing the foundation of her new reality. The Duke looked at her, his expression one of profound admiration. He had come looking for a subservient bride to secure a debt, and he had found a terrifyingly competent partner who demanded equality. It was a vastly superior arrangement. I would expect nothing less, Lady Eleanor, he said, offering a deep, formal bow that acknowledged her not just as a lady, but as a sovereign power in her own right. I look forward to reviewing the true ledgers with you. He stepped back, leaving her the space she required, the space she had earned. Eleanor remained seated in the chair, her shorn head held high, the ugly black bonnet lying defeated on the floor at her feet. She looked at the terrified, ruined figure of her stepmother, and then out the window toward the rolling green hills of the estate she had just saved. The terrible, clarifying silence of the room was no longer oppressive. It was the sound of a slate being wiped clean. In the months that followed, the transition of power was swift and absolute. Margaret and her daughters were banished to the bleak Yorkshire dower house, their social ambitions entirely destroyed by the quiet, devastating scandal of their financial ruin. Eleanor took possession of the master suite at Oakhaven. She did not buy new dresses, nor did she attempt to hide her growing hair beneath caps or wigs. She wore her hair short, a stark, striking crop that became a symbol of her authority. She spent her days riding the estate lines, meeting with tenants, and poring over the ledgers with the Duke's men of business, who quickly learned to fear and respect her sharp, uncompromising intellect. The specific daily work of paying proper attention to the estate brought Oakhaven back from the brink of ruin within a year. The fields were properly rotated, the mill was functioning at full capacity, and the debt to the Duke of Westford was systematically reduced. Eleanor built her life with the same meticulous care she applied to her accounting, ensuring every structural support was sound, every variable accounted for. Arthur, the Duke of Westford, became a frequent visitor to Oakhaven. Their meetings in the library, once the site of Eleanor's deepest isolation, became the center of a formidable partnership. They argued over crop yields, debated the merits of new agricultural technologies, and negotiated lease terms with a fierce mutual respect. It was during one of these late-night sessions, surrounded by maps and open ledgers, that Arthur finally proposed. He did not speak of poetry or overwhelming passion. He spoke of shared vision, of intellectual equality, and of the profound, quiet joy he found in her company. He asked her to bring her brilliant, analytical mind to Westford, to manage his vast holdings alongside him as his duchess. Eleanor listened to his proposal, analyzing the terms, assessing the man who had seen past the shorn hair and the ugly bonnet to the woman beneath. She realized that she did not need to retreat into the fortress of her mind anymore, because she had found someone who could stand on the battlements beside her. She accepted his proposal not as an escape, but as an expansion of her empire. When they married, she wore no veil, her short, dark hair catching the light, her eyes clear and victorious, looking forward to a reality she had built entirely on her own terms. It was not merely an ending, it was a real beginning.